and welcome to Ethics Now, a service of Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute. I'm David Price. Today, we're going to talk grammar, pronouns, specifically English pronouns, some of the smallest words in the language, but they carry a lot of weight, and they're among the most visibly evolving elements of the English language today, particularly with respect to gender equity. Today, we're going to be talking with two faculty fellows at the Rock Ethics Institute, Evan Bradley, he is an associate professor of psychology, and Laura Evans is an associate teaching professor of human development and family studies, both at Penn State Brandywine, and they are investigating the ethical principles impacting gender-neutral pronoun use and more. So let's get started. Laura, Evan, thank you very much for joining us here on Ethics Now. We appreciate it. I want to start off with why does it matter to get pronouns right?
That's a great question. I think it really becomes apparent if you think about speaking not just as language, but as an act in the world. So in linguistics, we call these speech acts, and there are lots of different kinds of speech acts. You can ask questions, you can provide information, you can also do social behaviors just by talking. And one of the things that you can say address people in different ways to show your social relationship to them. And one thing that we can do with language is to gender people. Right. So we kind of just think of gender often as something just about yourself, but we also go around and assign gender to lots of things, even objects and animals. And we do it to people by the way that we talk about them. So if I use a pronoun for someone, I am engaging in an act of assigning them gender, whether they like that or not. That's one thing that we're doing when we're talking. So it's another thing to be aware of when you talk, that is affecting your relationships with other people.
It seems like a really little thing, though, right?
Yeah, it is small, and a lot of language kind of goes underneath our conscious awareness, so we're not really aware of it. Even bigger things, bigger words than things like pronouns, we don't really think about what we're going to say before we open our mouths to start talking, and we don't necessarily remember, we remember the meaning or the purpose of what we were saying without remembering the words that we use to do that, right? Because it's operating on such an automatic level. That said, on the other side, as being the recipient or the listener, we are super aware, and even small variations like a pronoun or a tone of voice can really change what other people receive from the message that you're sending.
The name of the program here is Ethics Now, so I suppose we should go with, how is this an ethical issue?
So I think if we're talking about social relationships and how we treat people in the world, then ethics definitely has to come into play, because our decisions about how to treat people, be it verbally or non-verbally, that is an ethical decision, right? I kind of assess my relationship with that person and how I want to behave or what I want to get out of that relationship. And so the way that we choose to speak is an ethical decision, right? Just like choosing to, engage in certain kinds of work, or whether to, if I'm faced with a moral dilemma, what am I going to choose, right? If I'm faced with sort of possibly infinite ways to express myself through language, then the way that I choose to do that can be viewed through an ethical lens. And in terms of like relationships between people, I think Dr. Evans could definitely talk about like how our decisions about our connections to other people really influence how they perceive us and how that relationship is going to proceed.
Right. I think that using something like a pronoun, which David, you've said is a small thing, but like Evan was saying, those small things really add up, and they set the tone for how we engage with each other. And we know that pronoun use and getting pronouns right really matters for people's lives, that it doesn't feel like a small thing. And so we can't interpret it or assume that it is a small thing when there's a lot of data to suggest that it's actually a very big thing. And that when we get pronouns wrong, it does a lot of harm. And so when we think about pronouns through the lens of not just gender, but through the lens of ethics, that can then begin to guide us to not just understand why people are making the decisions to use someone's pronouns correctly or incorrectly, but to then influence and hopefully appeal to more people to get it right. Because we know that getting it right matters, that when we get it wrong, it causes not just frustration, but actual harm. And so I think that that issue of harm is central to why pronouns are an ethical issue, and why we've chosen to kind of take this approach and look at how people are making ethical decisions, and how we can then use that information to help people do better.
And I think there's been a lot of attention in sort of ethical circles lately about microaggressions. And you can see in the name of that, yes, they're micro, right? Meaning they're small little acts, but then the other part is aggression, right? So we often, and the reason that that name has been applied to that is that these are sort of very small, but yet harmful and aggressive acts and by calling them that, it sort of connects them to a spectrum of different things that are all connected to the same sort of worldview or ethical orientation, right? So from an outside or a privileged perspective, you might think, well, these are just some words that I use. But looking at it from a more systemic perspective, we can see how, the words we use that may not register to the person speaking them are experienced as harm by the people who are recipients of them. And those are of a kind with more egregious acts of either verbal abuse or of physical violence, right? That they're connected to each other, that engaging in that kind of speech sort of often leads to movement along that spectrum toward enabling more dehumanizing language and toward more actual acts of violence. And so that's why we connect even those small things to ethics, because they connect to those bigger issues that we would definitely describe as ethical problems.
I can't recall the actual saying, but death by 1,000 pinpricks or whatever it is, right? Like if you get stuck once, then okay, that's annoying. But if it happens to you every day, all the time, then my goodness, it would certainly be unbelievable.
Essentially, yeah, and that's really the key problem with microaggressions generally, and with pronouns in particular, in that if you're not aware of it, if you're not experiencing it, you're not aware of how often someone who doesn't get their correct pronouns most of the time would experience that, right? That it might be like, oh, I might notice that once a day that I'm, saying this word or using this. But for someone who has to go through life that way, you would notice those, and they pile up.
So I think I started studying pronouns in elementary school a lot, like really, and we were, talking about them a lot. We did that in the 60s. But I mean, so I have this incredible lifetime of using these pronouns in these contexts and being taught them, and this is how it is, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Laura, can you change people who have been taught for 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years how to change their pronoun usage?
Yeah, I have kind of two responses to that. The first is there's tremendous evidence that we can change what people do. I mean, in the social sciences, that's at the heart of a lot of the questions that we ask, is how do we influence what people do, right? And that's just a different way of saying change. And we know that context does change people, right? That if you had been a child in a classroom and learned a different way of using pronouns, that would be how you use pronouns, right? So learning provides us with a lot of evidence that we can in fact change. We can learn new things, we can modify what we know. And so we're starting from a space of thinking that yes, we can absolutely influence what people do. the second part is that the project we're working on, we're still answering that question of how do we change, right? So we're at the stage where we can identify that folks with certain moral dimensions or kind of ways of being in the world are more or less likely to use pronouns correctly. And now we're entering into the stage of, can we modify that? Can we change that? And if we can, then how do we disseminate and share that? But at the heart of our investigation is the belief that absolutely people can change, and that we can scaffold and structure environments for people to do that in ways that appeal to them, that kind of meet them where they are in terms of how they learn and experience the world, just like we would modify how we teach children to use pronouns, right? Like my child knows how to use they, them pronouns and can use them very fluently because they've had that exposure since day one. So their environment has been structured in a way where that is just how language works. And Evan can speak to this more, right? He understands how children develop language.
It's funny that you brought up the grammar lessons, David, because I was literally just a couple of weeks ago, thanks to homeschooling, looking at my son's grammar textbook, writing textbook that they use in school. And I was annoyed by it, of course, because it doesn't reflect like what I would consider to be normal American English usage. Because one thing we know is that the linguistic or the language standards that you're taught in school often don't reflect the way that users of the language actually speak, right? That there's a formal written standard, which is really a version of English that no person actually talks that way, right? And so, part of the struggle there is, what is the purpose of those standards, right? Sometimes it's for standardizing the communication to help people communicate in writing better. Sometimes it's, related to this attitude that, well, we should actually change the way people speak. But I would be willing to bet that even if you go back a few decades, you're going to see people diverging from the pronoun use that you see in the English textbook, right? Because a lot of those ideas persist for a long time. And I think that's one stumbling block that a lot of people bring up. They say, oh, I can't say singular they because that's not how I was taught in school. And a lot of time those people actually already do use that, right? That's part of the not being aware. We're much more aware of what we're doing when we're writing than we are when we're speaking, right? So a lot of people say like, oh, I never use singular they. And then if you look back at what they've said, you're going to find it, right? So that's part of it as well.
I will say that I'm a sentence diagramming geek, so I do it for entertainment. So I appreciate your moments there with your child. As a linguist, Evan, you bring up something historically. Here we're looking at pronoun usage and evolving it. Could you give me some type of example historically when in the English language we have done something similar? Because we live in the now. Those of us who are here today are only here today, and we didn't study the history of the English language. This can seem out of place and off-putting, frankly. What's happened with it in the past?
Well, there have been a lot of changes. All languages change over time. So there's no particular golden age that you can point to where you can say, yes, that's when English was perfect and things have gone downhill since then. They're always changing. And for the most part, people who are, let's just say, a little bit on in years will say, oh, things are changing. I don't tend to like that. And then, the kids are basically like, this is how we talk. This is how English works. And so it's natural to them, right? And then those people get older and sometimes they complain about what their kids are saying, right? So it's a tale as old as time, as it were. But with English pronouns, right? So they, come historically from their Germanic roots, but then they have changed over time. And one example would be that we used to have a distinction between singular and plural in the second person as well. So in English, we have distinction between singular and plural for first person, so I and we, and for third person, so he, she, and they, and then in plural, just they. But we used to have that in the second person as well. So we had thou and you, and thou went away, kind of disappeared, and you became the second person pronoun for both singular and plural, unless you are from the southern US, or you're from Philadelphia and you say yous, or you're from Pittsburgh and you say yins, right? That distinction is, a new distinction has come in to fill that in a few places. But what we end up with there is ambiguity, and language is filled with ambiguity. So if I say, you are nice, it's unclear if I'm talking to you, David, or to Laura and David collectively, right? It's ambiguous between that. I would have to clarify. And we can see that in the plural agreement with the verb. You have are rather than is, right? And most English speakers, they don't remark on that. They just clarify if they need to, or they get it from context and they move on. The they innovation is very similar, but just more recent. It's the plural moving in to take over some of the job of the singular. And so that would be a case where that happens. And we're just noticing it more because it's literally happened in our lifetimes, whereas you happened, as you said, hundreds of years ago, and nobody had to notice the change happening who's alive today.
And I think that that's a really interesting process to look at, is thinking not just can people make changes, but acknowledging that they do. But then the question becomes how, right? Like, how do those shifts happen? How do we influence what people do and say? And there are going to be some unfoldings of language that are kind of natural and organic, and there are other ways that we can be more directive with it. But kind of looping back to how we tie ethics into this project is, we recognize that there are going to be some folks who, when they hear about getting someone's pronouns correct, they're going to say, absolutely, I want to do that. I value taking good care of people. I value respecting people. There are other people who are going to arrive at that and say, that sounds really hard because it's different than what I learned in school. And so how we might approach both of those folks, I mean, the end goal is we want both of those people to be using pronouns correctly. But we acknowledge that there might be different pathways to getting them there, right? Based on kind of how they are experiencing the world, and how they see their involvement with it, right? So someone who says, yes, this is new to me, but I would like to get it right because I want to take good care of people. We can address that differently than someone who says like, I can't do this because it's so different than what I was taught. I think an important message for both of those folks is that language takes practice always, right? And being in relationship with people takes practice always. So when we're dealing with communication, the idea of effort and practice is always there, whether we're talking about pronouns or something else. So I think it's okay to kind of bring in that element of practicing language into the conversation, just like I would want, partners to practice speaking to each other in a way that is respectful and caring, right? We teach people how to use language all the time. So I think we can do it here, and that we can really kind of differentiate how we do it based on where people are coming from.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about it recently as kind of a three-pronged approach, or like it's a three-legged stool, as it were, the pronoun thing. And two of those are kind of in my wheelhouse, and then the other one is kind of what I'm getting into from working with Laura and from working with The Rock on some of these issues. So the first one is like the linguistic one, like what are the actual like grammatical and syntactic features that are coming into play here. And I think what research from our group, as well as from many colleagues that I have at work on this, is that most English speakers today have the linguistic tools to do, especially singular they, and they probably have the linguistic tools to do neopronouns as well. The second leg of that is the psychological side, and that has to do with people's conception of what sex and gender are, how they're related to each other, and how they relate to language. And that's where we see probably the most change happening right now, sort of society wide, and where we can see the greatest difference between people. So if we can identify people, who have different conceptions of gender, do you think about gender as a binary, or do you think about it as a spectrum, right? And because that has to match up with your linguistic tools, right? If your linguistic tools allow you to use non-binary pronouns, but your conception of gender does not let you legibly recognize people as belonging to different groups, then you're going to have trouble no matter how much your language has already prepared you to do that. And that's where the third leg comes in, and that's the ethical dimension, right? Does that mediate or help you sort of align your linguistic behaviors with your sort of psychological concepts? And I think the interactional part of that through ethical considerations is going to be where you can kind of harmonize those things together.
As we start pushing the the boundaries of our time, I think you've touched on this, but if I could ask you to crystallize, what's the deliverable after you do all the studying? What's going to drop?
I mean, I think the exact nature that takes, I think, remains to be seen depending on what we learn as we go through. But I think what's great about doing this within sort of the large institution that we're a part of, right, through and having the resources of Penn State and all of these different things, is that we can start testing out and trying out these things locally by working with initiatives that are already ongoing. So like different initiatives, like at our Brandywine campus, we have like a pronouns day recognition, and we have different initiatives going on there. And then if we can sort of test out our ideas for how to apply this, right? Like what kinds of materials are appealing to students or to faculty who want to know about this, and we can look at the trainings that go on for university wide for these things, and we can test that out. We can find out what works, and then use the institutional tools to kind of test and deploy those.
Right. I think ultimately the deliverable, and we'll see if we can get there, but the deliverable that we're hoping for is that we can create training tools that are really effective and helpful in getting people to use pronouns correctly. And so we recognize that individuals are the ones who are speaking the words, typing the words, using words, but often we interface with individuals when we are in groups, so through the workplace, through schools. And if we could create a training program that kind of is differentiated for folks depending on where they are in their learning about pronouns, then I think that would be the best end product we could hope for.
And part of this comes from things that have been feedback that I've received from people who've done our early studies, right? So like people have expressed like, I support this idea, I want to do better at this. Is there a way that you can help me do that, right? Like, I don't know how to do this without just going and talking to people and saying the wrong thing and then having them correct me, which feels maybe, like that is the way that this goes typically, but can we develop a tool that helps people? And we worked with a group of students over the summer and through the course of the fall to kind of develop I'd say a mock-up of our first version of these kinds of materials. Like we were calling it an after school special sort of format, where you see a little vignette where that involves a group of people negotiating pronoun use. And we made different versions of it that appeal to different ethical considerations. So we're applying different lenses of looking at ethics, right? If you think about how you treat other people or how you talk, you can come to different ethical conclusions by basing your decision on different premises, right? Like if my guiding principle is something like do no harm, right? I don't want to do anything that's harmful to other people. Then I will look at a given situation and see, okay, what can I do that's least harmful? Is it using someone's correct pronouns? Okay, then I'm going to do that. On the other hand, if I really value following rules, right, and I was taught in school that I can't say they for a singular person, then I might make a different decision in that situation. So appealing to their sense of empathy or harm, that might not be convincing to that person. So can we convince them more by explaining, how pronouns work and what the changes that have happened and how singular they works, right? Maybe different things are going to be appealing to that speaker.
Evan Bradley, Laura Evans, thank you very much. We look forward to said deliverable, and hopefully we'll be able to do a recap when it does come out, and tell folks
That
what
sounds
you
great.
found.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
You're very
Thank
welcome.
you so much.
Have a great day, and thank you for joining us here on Ethics Now for the Rock Ethics Institute. I'm David Price.